Hi everyone, it's Professor Chu and hope you're doing well. And week 3, we have a lot to cover in this lecture, so hang on, you might want to watch it in parts. And I also recommend for this lecture that you probably like to have your book, The Archaeology of Athens, out, since a lot of the material, we're covering pretty closely this week the monuments talked about in the book, and there are some really good visuals, I think, in the book, actually, between maps and photos and everything. And I've given you some other things too on the handout, but that might be helpful. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about first a little bit about Herodotus. We're not reading Aristotle for the first time this week. And then we are going to talk very briefly about the Persian Wars, because that will lead us into the building of some of the major monuments on the Acropolis of Athens, namely the Parthenon, sorry, that's the name of something else, the Parthenon, the Erechtheion, and the Propylaia. And so just taking a look at the notes that I prepared for you. And so, yes, Athens in and after the Persian Wars, and Herodotus on barbaroi. So these are the terms and concepts from this lesson to know. And I'm going to have a separate explanation video about the quiz. But generally, these terms are things that I would expect you to know to be able to define. I try to define them in the lectures and in the notes, just as a start for you. And also some online resources. There are a ton of resources. Many of them are sort of touristy websites, which are not bad, actually, because Greece is a very popular place to visit for very good reasons. But these, I think, are actually pretty good. I try to choose ones that come from universities, like Brown University or Reed College in Oregon. And these are also 2 really good articles that I wanted to point out to you. One is about the restoration of the Acropolis. It's from the British Museum. And the other is from the Rhode Island School of Design. It's about the Parthenon and the Erechtheion more particularly, and they're both PDFs. They're the kind of articles you could actually cite if you were doing a research essay. And then also this website here is about the Caryatids, is to the Acropolis Museum, which is an amazing museum in Athens. It's right across from the Acropolis. It has a lot of stuff in it, but it's also just sort of architecturally really amazing, because part of the museum is directly across from the top of the Acropolis, and it's not that far from it. So these are the periods of history that we've looked at so far in terms of these sites and what was built in the Acropolis in the Bronze Age, Minoan and Mycenaean civilization, the time of the Tholos, that's the plural, the big beehive tombs, the Dark Ages or the Iron Age, when we see a lot less building and construction and a change in the way people are buried, fewer artifacts being produced, simpler pottery. And then the Archaic Age, which was actually the age of the tyrants, namely Pisistratus, and really is when Athens starts to come into its own. Also the age at the start of Homer. So some of this information on this chart is repeated, slightly watered down, streamlined for your purposes. I wanted to highlight here that all these events are actually talked about in Herodotus' Histories, which is what we, of course, are reading from this week. So these are basically, I would say, everything on this chart is the historical period that we're looking at this week, with a much bigger emphasis on really 510 and on. But a couple words about Herodotus. Some of you have read Herodotus before in another class, even one of my classes. I'm going to fix that on the handout. Anyways, Herodotus of Halicarnassus. So Herodotus is actually from what is modern-day Turkey, southwestern Turkey, a city called Bodrum. And he actually spent most of his life traveling around the Mediterranean. He possibly was a merchant. We don't know what Herodotus did, why he wrote these accounts. And he ended up actually living in southern Italy, which was colonized by the Athenians. So he was probably born around 480 to 479 BCE, which is the time of the Persian Wars. And he lived until the Peloponnesian War, which is the war between Athens and Sparta. And Herodotus' work is really known as the first major Western text about geography and ethnography, especially though most people come to Herodotus first about history. He writes the first well, the most authoritative account, you could say, or the main account that we have in Western history, literature about the Persian Wars. Now, I don't I'm not going to go over everything about the Persian Wars at all, because I feel that you can probably get some of it just by looking at this PowerPoint. Some of you will recognize the PowerPoint because, yes, it is somewhat reused from a different class, but the Persian Wars are history. They didn't change too much from when they occurred. So I'm not really highlighting a lot of the details about the Persian Wars for our class. If you want to take Greek civilization, I really encourage you to do that, because it's a fascinating story about how Athens, a very small city-state, defeats or at least prevents the vast Persian Empire. So this is the reach of the Persian Empire. Greece is here. Athens is located around here. And it's not that the Athenians defeated the entire Persian Empire. Alexander the Great does that, about almost 200 years later. But the Persian Empire stretched all the way, as you can see, to modern-day Afghanistan, really getting very close, actually, to India, even in parts of India, and including Egypt, and stretching out also towards the Caspian Sea, really into the Greek mainland in Thrace. So the Persian Wars is the moment when the Athenians, it's not only the Athenians, but the Athenians join with the Spartans and other Greeks to keep the Persians from invading the Greek mainland. So again, the Persians end up going back to Persia defeated. They're not, their empire is still quite intact. This handout gives you more information about the Persians themselves. So this is a painting, relief, of a Persian warrior. And then it has more extensive information about each of the battles, the main battles that were fought during the Persian Wars. But you get enough on this handout. I give you just sort of the big summaries and dates to let you know about them. And Herodotus actually recounts the Persian Wars. He doesn't really get into these famous battles, though, until the second half of the Histories. So the Histories is a very long work. I'm really not asking you to read most of it. In fact, we're reading some of the odder parts, sort of the ethnographic parts, because in them Herodotus has a fascination with barbaroi, shall we say. That is to say, he talks about, now barbaroi, it is obviously translated in English into barbarians, but what do the Greeks mean by barbarians? The Greeks, who are also the Hellenes, as they are referred to in your text, because Hellas is the Greek word for Greece. Hellas is the Greek word for Greece. To the Greeks, a barbaroi means somebody who doesn't speak Greek. It doesn't necessarily mean that you are uncivilized, or in fact, it can often mean the very opposite. Many of the barbaroi who the Greeks encountered actually belonged to cultures that were much more sophisticated, with much larger cities, especially, than anything at that time in Athens. So that's why earlier this semester, if I may scroll back a couple of weeks, you can see that at the time that Athens is not even founded, this in the Near East, the Sumerian Empire exists. There are the Assyrian Empire, the Akkadian Empire. The Greeks come much later, you could say, and of course the Romans even later than that. Remember, Rome wasn't founded until after the first Olympic Games. So the Greeks were very aware of the barbaroi, so to speak. We also have to think a little bit about what we mean by Greeks. Greek in Herodotus doesn't only mean people who live in the Greek mainland, what we think of Greece today. It means those who speak Greek. And that actually included Herodotus. Herodotus, as I said, was from Turkey. He was not born in the Greek mainland, so he was part of a bigger Greek culture. But he was certainly not a citizen of Athens or Sparta or any place like that. This chart just gives you a little idea of, if you're reading his histories, this is mostly in the parts that we're not reading, or maybe you've read before. These are when Herodotus talks about these other peoples here. These are actually people who speak Greek. So it could include the tyrants like Pisistratus, it includes the Athenians, the Spartans. The barbaroi include the Persians and their kings, and many of the nations that they've subjected to them, and that actually includes Egypt, but also places, the Scythians, the Ethiopians, so lots of other peoples. So And Herodotus, as I said, is generally known as a writer of history, but also he has a fascination with other places. Herodotus, it seems, did travel around, and his method of writing history, but also of finding out about other cultures and peoples, is to ask questions, to make an inquiry. The word history actually means an inquiry, a critical study of past events. And so Herodotus lives at a time also when Greek science and philosophy are coming into their own, with both Greek science and philosophy and history interested in using ideas of rational inquiry to find out the truth about the world, with critical rigor, a concern for proof, and respect for evidence. And so that's what Herodotus does. He constantly looks for proof, weighs the evidence, talks about his process in doing this. And what's different about Herodotus than, say, a medical writer or a philosopher is that, of course, he's looking at human events. And we didn't actually have to read this and reading about the Lydians, the Egyptians, and Babylon. But Herodotus says at the very start of the Histories that what his history is really going to be about is an account of the cities of men, small as well as great. For those which in old times were great have for the most part become small. For those that were in my own time great, used in former times to be small. So then, since I know that human prosperity never continues to be steadfast or never stays the same, I shall make mention of both indifferently. So Herodotus is really aware of history as change over time, that places rise and fall. Once upon the time, right, the US was a colony of England. Now it's a very large country, undergoing some interesting political circumstances. And another, Greece once upon a time was a powerful country that really ruled the Mediterranean. And Greece, as we know now, is a country with an extremely high unemployment rate, about most of the younger people leaving the country, and some really severe economic problems, and has required bailouts from the International Monetary Fund. But really great history and great food, and that's just some of the reasons to go to Greece and learn about it. The US is a very young country. I'm going to tell you, and I took students to Greece a couple years ago, for 3 years in a row. The tour guide, said to me, "So you're Chinese?" And I said, "Yes, I'm Chinese American. I'm a third generation. My grandparents came from China." And the tour guide said to me, "Oh, well then I won't make fun of your culture because it's older than ours." I said, "Hey, So it was very funny. Also kind of because there's a lot of Chinese investment going on in Greece. Okay, this is the digressions I get into if you were actually listening to me in class, in a real setting. So on to the text. I also included here in these notes a synopsis of the entire Histories, which you don't really need, I admit. So this is a little overkill. What I did put into larger font was the part that you do need to know, which is the parts about Lydia, Babylon, and Egypt. And I included these because Herodotus includes them for a reason. He keeps these cities in here because they prove their evidence for his thesis, that cities that were great, like the kingdom of Lydia. So by city here, he also refers to this more extended idea of a city, of a kingdom, or sort of a bigger political entity. So he says here that cities like Lydia and Babylon, what happens to both of these cities early in Herodotus' Histories in the first book is they fall to the mighty Persian Empire under Cyrus. And Herodotus describes that in some detail. Book 2 is all about Egypt. And Herodotus he devotes a full book to Egypt as another great civilization. He talks about it because he's going to start talking about how the Persians, under another king named Cambyses, will invade Egypt. And Herodotus, what he's interested in Egypt is he thinks it's one of the oldest civilizations, and Egypt is always talked about in Greek literature as an older, even the oldest civilization. There's a real sense of the ancientness of Egypt. And Herodotus notes many fascinating things about Egyptian culture, which he thinks are often better than things in Greek culture, including the calendar, for instance. He talks a lot about the Nile River. This is a map of how Herodotus saw the world, or how people at his time seem to have thought about it. Ancient people did not necessarily think the world was flat. And some people did actually think it was round. I mean, they couldn't actually prove it. They certainly did think that the US existed. They figured, you know, if you went, you know, I think from one side to the other, you would end up in India, basically. So, you know, little did they know, here we are. This is the idea, in other words, of the Mediterranean world. So Europe is here, Greece would be here. This would actually be the middle, well, Turkey, the Middle East. This would be Arabia, so proportions aren't quite right, as you can see. India, no idea. China. The Greeks actually did have some idea of the Chinese, the Seres, as they're called in Latin, and really because of trade. So, in fact, Buddhism actually came to Greece. So, digression. So this would be Africa, Ethiopia, and Herodotus actually goes on to say that he thinks that Egypt is so big that it should actually be its own, you know, region on its own. The fourth landmass, and we know that he wasn't entirely right about that, unless he was sort of thinking of Egypt as, you know, the whole of Africa. But in this reading, you're going to find that there is a lot of detail. You don't need to know all that detail at all. That's how Herodotus writes. He's voluminous. He records lots of different facts. He's not a philosophical writer like Aristotle. You don't have to quite pay attention in the same way. He's really a storyteller who likes to think about theories and ideas, and that includes scientific theories like, why does the Nile rise and fall? What are its sources? Really fascinating part of the reading that I think you might find interesting is when he talks about Egyptian customs. And it's famous idea that the Egyptians pretty much are opposite Greeks in every way, especially in their male and female relations. One of them he suggests, for instance, is that, you know, women actually stand up to go about, you know, their business, not men, and that Egyptians relieve themselves inside their houses instead of outside, and eat outside. And so this passage about the Egyptians and their culture is often taken to seem that Herodotus is defining the Egyptians as opposite Greeks, to be Egyptian or barbaroi. Again, thinking that that word doesn't have entirely the pejorative sense that we think it has, is to be utterly different from the Greeks. And he does, again, though, have a huge amount of respect and fascination, even with the Egyptians, saying that they provide the origins of Greek religion. Heracles is originally an Egyptian god. Many gods are borrowed from the Egyptians, he says. And oracular practices that we see in places like Dodona, which is in Greece, are actually come from Egypt. So in other words, many things can be attributed to Egypt. And I gave you an article here from a man who worked at the Art Institute of Chicago about religious parallels between Greeks and Egyptians, if you'd like to explore that further. And so that's all that we're reading from Herodotus' history. But if you want to read more, I really do encourage you to, because I think Herodotus is a great read. And he's a great storyteller, especially if you want to read the part about the Persian Wars. That is really where the action picks up around book 6. Very briefly, the Persian Wars is the story of how, as in revenge for some Greeks helping out some other Greeks who lived on this western coast of Turkey, because this western coast of Turkey was actually colonized by Greeks. The Persian king attacked some Greek culture, Greek-speaking cities. They called in the Athenians to help them. The Athenians burned a temple at Sardis, which was the capital of Lydia, became a Persian city. In revenge, the Persians wanted to attack the Greeks. So Darius, or Darius, as he's sometimes called, his name is pronounced, staged a huge attack coming over. You know, the Persian Empire controlled a lot of northern Greece up here in Thrace, and also coming over on boats. And the first major battle is fought at Marathon, where, to everyone's surprise, the Athenians, with helped up by their allies, including the Plataeans, defeat the Persians. And this leads to, as very nicely outlined in your book, I should say. As outlined in your book, well, this is where you do want to have the book. So the book here, it goes somewhat into the battles, but it explains, for instance, this Soros, or mound. This is a mound of actually that the Athenians built to their dead who were killed in the fighting against the Persians. And this is an example also of the helmet of Miltiades, who was the Athenian general. He dedicated that at Olympia. And so much of this chapter, this is possibly a grave for some of the allies who fought with the Athenians, the Plataeans, but it's not clear if it was. For one thing, the bodies that were found in this grave do not appear to be wounded. So that would suggest they weren't really fighting in that battle. But I provide you with here with some other links. Go back to that. To these monuments. And let's see. Yes. So you can see here there is a link for the Soros. For instance, the mound, Miltiades' bronze helmet. It's a much more dramatic rendition of it. And also for you to think about that many of the buildings, I mean, the sort of topic for this lecture on the syllabus says religion, and the part we're going to talk a little bit later in this lecture about buildings that are on the Acropolis, like the Parthenon and the Erechtheion. Greek religion is, and its connection to architecture, is very much wound up in the importance of a city in a Greek citizen's life. In other words, Greek religion, first of all, ancient Greek religion is not based on a set of belief. It is not an orthodoxy. If you don't believe that, you don't have to believe in a certain kind of creed or doctrine, for instance, like the Nicene Creed in Christianity. What you do have to do, though, is it's a religion of ritual practice. And so, in other words, to show you're religious, you have reverence for the gods, you make the proper sacrifices. One of the reasons that Herodotus is so fascinated by the Egyptians is because they are also a people, as he describes them, who follow a lot of religious practices. They often involve animals. They involve keeping oneself clean and purified. They involve priests, and they involve not doing certain things in certain areas. See, let that thought go. But so these monuments like the Soros, which do, come to have a kind of, I guess you could say, religious significance. It's not just, of military significance or historical significance. They occupy a huge importance in, the civic imagination and belief of what it means to be an Athenian citizen. For instance, Aeschylus, the famous tragedian, he fought at the Battle of Marathon, and that's always remembered not only by his rivals, actually, and by later playwrights. They bring that up about Aeschylus, as this model of an Athenian citizen who believed very much in democracy and the Athenian democratic system. Because certainly the Battle of Marathon and the defeat of the Persians is seen as the Athenian democracy defeating the much larger Persian army, but also, as we discussed in the Criminals and Saints class last semester, the defeat of tyranny by a democratic government, or polis. And so, in other words, these monuments, like the monument to the dead, the dedication of Miltiades' helmet, and the temples that are built to Athena Nike, they are religious. Certainly, a temple is a religious building, but they also involve the political, civic, and communal life, really, of Athenians. The temple to Athena is a temple of Athena Nike, or Nike, more correctly pronounced, which means Athena as a victory goddess. And also, again, a statue of Athena Promachos, which is Athena as, a warrior, someone who fights in battle. So, in other words, many of the early monuments and temples in Athens, there are some buildings, such as the ones we looked at last week, like fountains and political buildings. Many of them are also religious, but also they can be created to commemorate military battles and take on, to some extent, an important, somewhat religious significance. Just a little bit of a word about Athenian democracy. What were the Athenians defending? The Athenians threw off the tyrants, Pisistratus, around the end of the 6th century, and Cleisthenes, who is an aristocrat, for reasons that we don't really know why, institutes a bunch of democratic reforms, which result in Athens having its radical or extreme democracy, which really is the reason that Athens comes to power, defeating the Persians, and also turns out to be somewhat Athens' undoing in the Peloponnesian War that it fights against the Spartans. Basically, this complicated weaving-looking chart is a way of trying to explain how Cleisthenes basically re-divided the Athenian population. And remember, we said that Athens includes not only the city proper, but also Attica, the land around it, so all the people in the villages, or demes. So what Cleisthenes did was he drew up lists of citizens saying there are 150 demes. So the demes are sort of these smaller communities. They're sort of towns or townships. I think that Jersey word is a good word to describe them. You know, so some very small towns in New Jersey, like Garwood, which used to be next to the town I lived in, Cranford. Garwood's sandwiched between Westfield and Cranford doesn't have its own high school. But the students don't go to high school in Cranford or Westfield, they go to high school in Springfield, which is not particularly near them. But anyways, Cleisthenes divided up the population between the cities, the hills, and the coast. So he divided up all the people in the demes between these three different geographical regions of Athens. And then he also created these larger units called atrities, which means a third. So this was, each region had 10 trities. So there were 30 trities in all. And then out of those trities, so out of these 30 larger units of the demes, he created the 10 tribes, or the phuli. And these are really the sort of powerhouse of the Athenian democracy. So each of the 10 tribes is composed of a trities from each of the regions. Okay, so you have 150 demes. They get divided up between the cities, the hills, and the coasts. And those of those people in the demes, they're divided up 10 more times. I know this is kind of complicated. I have to wonder how in the world Cleisthenes even managed to do this, explain this to all these people. Then people from each of these different regions are mixed up into tribes. So in other words, what you have is a system of government where people are put into groups that are not based on just where they live. They are mixed up with people in the whole region of Athens and Attica from different parts. So, you know, you could be mixed up with someone from South Jersey, North Jersey, and Central Jersey, for instance, you know, or I don't know, South Jersey, North Jersey, the shore, and Central Jersey, kind of going out. Each of the tribes, by the way, was named after an Athenian hero. So that gave every person a connection to some kind of ancient Athenian hero. And this was, this other map here, actually, I know it looks a little complicated, but in some ways it actually gives a sense of how these tribes were formed. What it tries to do is that if you're a circle, you are from a trities, which is from the city proper of Athens. If you, the triangles indicate the trities that are inland, and the squares, the ones on the coast, although they're a little bit mixed up. The size of these different shapes indicates how large the demes were that combined these trities. And then the different colors, well, there's actually 10 colors on this map. That shows the tribes of Athens. Yeah, it took me quite a long time. I had to stare at this diagram for quite a while just to think of how to explain it. But as you can see, around the city of Athens, the population is much more dense. In fact, there's even a better explanation of the different city trities here. And then whereas the population in farther regions of the coast is a little bit smaller. But it gives you a sense of how Athenians from really different parts of their city and of Attica were brought together. Really, like in New York City, very similar. You know, it's a huge, huge city, 5 different boroughs, and you know, Staten Island, Manhattan, you're all part of Bronx, you're all part of, you're all a New Yorker. And so there are circles, triangles, and squares. Each of those then represents the different regions. So this is how Cleisthenes mixed up the population, and it was very successful It laid the ground for Athenians' radical democracy. So Athenian democracy is a direct democracy. It's not like our system of government where we elect senators and congressmen to represent us in Washington, D.C. Instead, you stand on a hill called the Pnyx and you vote in the assembly, which can, or the ecclesia. The tribes, so those 10 tribes would select the 50 members for a council of 400, which eventually is a council of 500. This is the Senate. So the Boule, the Senate, which is an advisory body to the assembly, is again selected. Its members are selected from the 10 different tribes by lottery. And they actually participate in the day-to-day governance of the assembly. There were also elected generals called the strategoi, who faced financial scrutiny on leaving office, review the records, and juries of up to 501 with members of Athenian citizens. Juries eventually is a paid job, not a lot of pay, 3 obols a day. And well, who's not included in this? Well, not all Athenian citizens could vote. Women, children, obviously. Slaves could not vote. And medics, who are resident foreigners. So this system is the system that won the Battle of Marathon. And Herodotus, well, he doesn't go into the details of Athenian government. He's very flattering about Athenian government and the democracy as the reason that the Athenians, because they were fighting for freedom, they were fighting for themselves, and they were fighting to defend their own land. That's why they defeated the Persians. The Persians were not happy about being defeated at the Battle of Marathon, and after Darius died, his son Xerxes came to power. Hippias, the son of Pisistratus, the tyrant, had actually had to flee to Persia. He got expelled, and after that, Cleisthenes instituted his reforms. So Xerxes invaded Greece in 480. This resulted in the really famous battles of Thermopylae and Salamis. And what he did was he destroyed Athens. He invaded the city. He desecrated all the temples. They were burned to the ground. We have evidence of this because we can see the Chori and the other statues, and who were buried in Athens. Examples of pottery shards. Athens is basically destroyed. You might be saying, well, what happened to all the men, women, and children who couldn't leave? Well, actually, Themistocles, who was an archon or official of Athens, had the foresight, partially because of an oracle, which said that he should, the Athenians needed to protect themselves with a wall of wood, i.e. a wall of ships, that was how they would defeat the Persians. So he actually, Athens was evacuated when they knew the Persians were coming. Everybody took refuge on an island called Evia, or Euboea. And as a result, the city was destroyed completely, but the Athenian citizens were not enslaved or killed, which is what ancient people do to their enemies. And then the Athenians and, well, the combined forces of the Athenians and their allies defeated the Persians at Salamis after the famous Battle of Thermopylae, where the 300 Spartans and their allies, it wasn't just the Spartans, were killed. And then in the Battle of Plataea, the Persians were finally defeated and kicked out of the Greek mainland, so to speak. Now, after the Battle of Plataea, the Athenians took an oath that they would not rebuild any temples and monuments that had been destroyed by the Persians, and really as a sign of memorial again. So in other words, if this was the Acropolis before the Persian Wars, this is an older temple to Athena, an older Propylaia, and this is a temple to Zeus that was not finished, and an older Parthenon. All of these were destroyed. They were burned to the ground. We can see that because of the burning of the stone. Athens, of course, was a city. People lived in wooden houses, so all this was burnt too. So at first of all, the Athenians did not start to rebuild. But gradually, over time, they did. And as we'll see, it was under another ruler, whose name was Cimon, discussed in chapter 4, that the Athenians decided that they would rebuild their monuments that had been destroyed by the Persians. And they were able to do this because of Athenians' growing power. So Athens grew in power because of creating something called the Delian League. So after the defeat of the Persians, Athens decided that it still had to keep the Persians at bay. So it built up its fleet of ships. Ancient Greek ships are called triremes. The Spartans, on the other hand, as an example, went home. They were not interested in expanding their borders and expanding their reach. Sparta is not interested in trade, but the Athenians were. Certainly the Athenians had always been a ship-going culture, interested also in commerce. So the Athenians agreed to give protection to other cities, other islands that were being bothered by the Persians, forming something called the Delian League, which the original idea behind the league was that each member had to put in a certain amount of capital every year, or contribute ships. Since Athens alone could contribute the ships, the other cities had to contribute the money. The result was that Athens was able to use the money to build ships, which they said was to protect everybody else, which was the purpose. But the result was that Athens became more and more of a dominant figure in this league and led to the creation of the Athenian Empire, symbolized when the Athenians decided to move the treasury, which had been on the island of Delos, an island in the Aegean Sea. They decided to move that treasury, so here's Delos, to Athens. So it's kind of a sign of what's going on. And the Peloponnesian War broke out because Sparta correctly noticed that Athens was getting a little powerful, a little pushing its borders. And so Sparta and its allies, many of whom were from the Peloponnese, joined. And the result was a 30-year war, which led to the Athens' complete loss of its empire. And for a while, Sparta was dominant. It resulted in the democracy getting thrown out. And a lot of executions, violence, exile. In some ways, ending up with great leaders, the death of Socrates, who does not seem to have been entirely in support of the Athenian democratic government. Anyways, the other long shot was that the Spartan Empire too, Spartan power was also actually kind of fizzled out after this period. That's what happens after classical Greece. But we're still looking at that period. We're going to look at that's what we're talking about. So what happens though in classical Greece? Well, Athens is on its rise. Athens finds that it has all of this money, basically, to build ships, sure. It moves that treasury to Athens under another general, an official named Cimon, who was actually Miltiades' general's son. A lot of sort of beautification and expansion process went on with the Agora, because the Athenians certainly returned to a city that had been razed and greatly and totally damaged by the Persians. So the academy where Plato and Aristotle will have their schools becomes, a well-tended grove with a gymnasium founded. Gymnasium does not mean a gym. It actually refers to a school where one would both engage in physical training, but also in intellectual and philosophical, mathematical training. Cimon did a number of things to raise, how should we say, Athenian, to raise the architectural profile of Athens, bringing back the bones of Theseus from an island called Skyros, putting him in a sanctuary. Theseus, remember the legendary king of Athens who created democracy, building these long walls to the Piraeus, the port of Athens. These will be very important during the Peloponnesian War, and also starting to rebuild the Agora with a building, for instance, called the Historia Propylaia, which contained mythological and historical scenes, and also building up buildings like the Tholos, which is a round building, dining hall, and also the Clepsydra. And so if you go to these links, you will be able to see all these things that I am showing you. I won't go over all of them here because I think you can look at them on your own, but I will just point out here is the Tholos. So that actually is the same word as the word for the beehive tomb, but here it refers to a round building that possibly here. This is the Athenian Agora. This is the Acropolis. And one of the difficulties in excavating in Athens is that, Athens is a living city with, hundreds, thousands of people living there. So some parts Some of the places that have been excavated were actually occupied, 200 to 300 years ago. So people who lived there had to be cleared out in order to excavate, see what was under the ground. And so I think that whenever you dig in Greece, basically you find something. For instance, many discoveries were made when the metro was being created in Athens. And there's actually the Acropolis metro station has some archaeological statues and things you can look at when you're waiting for your train. So it's the fascination of going to Athens. And Kristina also created a klepsydra, which is a fountain house. And what the amazing thing about this was that it enabled Athenians living in the city to actually have a place to go and get water while they were inside the city. But the real building really starts in Athens under Pericles. So Pericles is the great archon general of Athens who really presides over Athens, and it's really its height, the golden age, so to speak. This is the time of Sophocles writing, and Socrates is alive, teaching. And this is the time when with all this money, thanks to the Delian League, Pericles undertakes, I wouldn't say in defiance, but he sort of overlooks the Platonian pledge not to rebuild the temples destroyed by the Persians, and he starts to really rebuild the Acropolis into the way that we think of Athens today. Namely, the construction of the Parthenon, and also the construction of the Propylaia. This is sort of the entrance gate to get into that you go through when you climb up on the Acropolis. It's very, very grand. And also the construction of the Erechtheion, which is the temple to Erechtheion, the ancient king of Athens. So the book, I think, goes over this quite well. Remember, our author, Mr. Camp, Professor Camp, was one of the time the director of the excavations of the Agora here. All right, you see a painting of it. And he goes into more detail about rebuilding Athens as a city. These are the long walls, for instance. So this is the city of Athens, the Piraeus, the port. And during the Peloponnesian War, the Athenians actually all came into the city of Athens while the Spartans were ravaging the countryside. This led to some problems like plague, which actually killed off Pericles himself right at the start of the war in 429 BCE. But the war then went on for really over 25 years. As you can see here, Plato's Academy is outside the city of Athens. And if you're reading Plato, you will notice that Socrates talks about going outside the city. And he really does mean that. By going outside the city, he means, going outside the main walls of the city. So, and also must point out this building called the Stoa Poikile, this painted, stoa where people could meet and talk, and which have paintings, and also the paintings suggest bronze shields. Well, one thing to remember about Greek temples is that they were very brightly painted. We have this image of the beautiful white Parthenon, the beautiful white marble, and that is what we see in buildings that are sort of in Grecian style. No, to mind, there must be some around Rutgers. There's certainly some, some of the monuments in Washington are made to look like that, like the Washington Memorial, white column. But the reality was the Greeks liked color. They painted everything really brightly. We know this thanks to being able to examine things with, thanks to more to technological innovations, to see that actually there are paint chips left on the statues. They simply faded with time, and they were definitely painted in bright blues and oranges and reds. We would consider it color overdrive, but that is ancient taste. So this is the Tholos, for instance, the Bouleuterion, where the Boule met, and onto the Parthenon. So under Pericles. So the Parthenon, it is the temple to Athena. And one thing to keep in mind, though, is it's not really this is the thing to keep in mind about Greek religion. Again, it's a religion where what you do, the rituals that you perform, it means that you are religious. It is not a matter of your belief. It is religion of practice, not of orthodoxy. That also holds for Roman religion. Christianity is a new innovation that way. The Parthenon is not a building that's so much associated with religious practices. It's really, it is, you know, the temple to Athena, the goddess of the city. So there's really no separation, you could say, between church and state in ancient Greece. It's an unusual building with the 8 columns across, 17 on the sides. There's called Doric columns, which are these bigger, kind of massive, less ornamented columns. And it's also Mr. Camp, as I'll call him. He points out a really good way, I think, to think about the structure of the Parthenon, the 3 different points. First of all, there's sort of 4 different parts to the interior of the Parthenon. There's the front porch, the pronaos. Naos means the porch. It comes to mean a temple, actually, under the Christians. With the 6 Doric columns, this is the pronaos. This is the opisthedomos, or the back porch, which also has 6 columns. So it's sort of a temple within, you know, this colonnade. Then here, this is what is called the hekatompedos naos. Hekatompedos means the 100-foot cella. So sort of this inner area. And this is actually called the Parthenon proper. The Greeks called it that. It's where the it was sacred to Athena. So those are some things to, when you're remembering the Parthenon, you know, think about it with the 8 columns in the front and the back, the Doric columns, 17 across, and then with the pronaos, 6 columns, the opisthedomos, 6 columns, you don't need to know these Greek terms, by the way. If you want to memorize them, that is fabulous. Especially, I think, if you're doing classic, you should memorize some of them. Hekatompedos, naos, and then, which, by the way, has a column, and then more colonnades here, and then through the columns, you would actually see there's a statue here of Athena in the Parthenon, the back chamber. So that's one way to think about the interior of the Parthenon. Then there's the outside. Well, on the outside of the Parthenon, the thing to keep in mind is that this is a building famously with no straight lines. And that is, so it's not that the Parthenon is an optical illusion, but the Greek architects, they clearly knew what they were doing, shall we say. When we think of the Parthenon, you know, if you were to draw it as a child, it looks like this, you know, you draw these straight lines, because that's what it looks like. The reality is that the columns taper upward in a curved line. So they're not entirely straight, as suggested here. They're not on the platform or the stylo. There's something called the curvature of the stylobate. Okay, so the stylobate is the surface that the columns are resting on. And notably, the steps curve up towards the middle. So this is a phenomenon called the curvature of the stylobate. And they're lower at the ends, but to your eye, it looks like it's straight, but it's actually not. And then the corner columns are actually 1/40th larger in diameter. Also, the columns all incline inward. So I guess, you know, the idea is if you could draw an infinite line, they would gradually, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of meters in the sky, they would meet. So, and all of this is thought to give the Parthenon a sense of movement upward. Other parts about the other things that make the Parthenon a very unique building are its sculptural adornment. So famously, the Parthenon was covered with reliefs, in particular at the pediments. And so there's a diagram here with the parts of a Greek temple. So the pediment is this part here. You have your columns here. So this is a Doric column. This is an Ionic column. You will need to know that for the quiz. Totally separate video. This one's getting long. I know. I told you it would. It is. So here we have, yes, the stylobate. This is the column, the Doric column, and the Ionic column, which is a little bit fancier. The roof here, and yes, the columns are called orders. And then if you have sort of this, the flat surface of the roof and then the steep surface above it, so rain, etc., can wash off. That surface underneath is called the pediment, and that was highly decorated in the case of the Parthenon with the birth of Athena on the east side, which is actually the entrance with the Olympic gods watching, and then a contest of Athena and Poseidon for the rule of Athens. It was surrounded by chariot groups and the royal families of Athens on the west. Remember, the western end, which is actually what you see first when you walk up the Acropolis, is actually the back. On the outside, there was a Doric frieze with 92 metopes with 4 different scenes. So the metopes are, in other words, between right under the pediment, holding up the roof. There are these spaces in between that are called the metopes, and those should be decorated with 4 different sort of themed scenes, namely a gigantomachy, so that's a fight between giants and gods. If you've read the Theogony, he talks about that. Greeks versus centaurs on the south. That's the side of the theaters. Greeks versus Amazons on the west, so that would be the side that you would see first as you were walking in, and then Greeks versus Trojans on the north. Then on that inside part of the Parthenon, there was an Ionic frieze on top of the 2 porches that depicts the famous Panathenaic procession. So these are the famous marbles that seem to provide an idea for us what this procession that this religious festival that the Athenians held once a year, where many of the citizens would actually come together in a huge procession, you know, with musicians and people carrying baskets, trays of cakes, and priests and 100 bulls marching up to the Acropolis to make a huge sacrifice to Athena and bring her a new dress of peplos that was specially woven. These marbles are sometimes called the Elgin marbles because they were famously in the 19th century taken off the Parthenon by a British aristocrat, Sir Elgin, and most of them are actually in the British Museum. But they all are in the British Museum. Greece wants them back. I personally think Greece should have them back. They built, editorializing, the Greeks have built this amazing museum, the Acropolis Museum. And when you go to the museum, when you go to the top floor, they have created a replication of all of the Parthenaic frieze that was originally on the inner cella, the inner chamber, on top of the 2 porches and the side walls. So, you know, within the inner colonnade. If you go to this museum, there's a replica, but you can actually walk around it, and it's literally right across from where the Parthenon is. So you realize that, you know, having these sculptures inside a museum in London doesn't really give you the full effect of what it would have been like for an ancient Athenian who would have seen these on the top of a mountain in a temple. The last thing that was the sculpture adornment of the Parthenon was this golden ivory or chryselephantine statue of Athena. So in other words, the statue would have had gold, for instance, for ornamentation, and ivory for her skin, for instance. And chryselephantine literally means gold. Chrys means gold. Elephantine, like elephant, means ivory. It's a huge, much copied statue dedicated in 438 with her holding a Nike and fully armed and with a serpent at her feet. So again, what you need to know, I think, about the Parthenon is that it has these 4 parts in the interior, these very special refinements that make it appear to be the building to be moving upward, and also the 4 different kinds of sculpture on the pediments, the metopes, the frieze on the inside with the Panathenaic procession, and the chryselephant statue of Athena. And our book, I do think, lays out this very nicely. Well, to get up to the Acropolis, it's very steep, actually, and there really isn't ramps. Plenty of people walking up there in flip-flops and high heels. If this is the Parthenon, over here, remember, this is the entrance. So the Panathenaic procession would have come over here and then gone up, and this is the Propylaia, which we're going to talk about next. This is the Erechtheion here, which is a temple to Erechtheus, the ancient king of Athens. Is much more of a religious building than the Parthenon itself. The Propylaia, it really functions. It was a building that originally, it really was supposed to have 5 parts, sort of a central hall that you walk in here through these Doric columns again. And then off to this side, this is the Pinatheca, which is a building that actually contained paintings, many of mythological scenes. And on the other side, there is another small structure here, which actually gives you access to the Temple of Athena Nike, a small temple here, which has 4 columns in front and 4 columns in back. And originally, there were supposed to be more buildings attached to the Propylaia here, but they were not finished because the Propylaia was built, started around 432 BCE. The next year, the Peloponnesian War broke out. But it's a very, very commanding structure. Believe I left you with an image of it after. I know I'm wasting time scrolling. Here it is. Where is that Propylaia? Yes. Okay. So this is the Propylaia now. It's very, very commanding. It's at the Pinatheca. This is the Temple of Athena Nike, you can see here. And these are the massive, as you can see, Doric columns of the Propylaia and the huge marble ceiling going across. And again, Camp, I think, provides a very good explanation of the Propylaia and its many features. I highlighted a couple of them for you here about the Pinacotheca, about the number of columns it has, that it has the central column with the western, 2 wings, one on the west with 3 small Doric columns, and the 2 eastern wings that were never actually built. And we know that the Propylaia wasn't finished because actually we can see that there are still lifting bosses or sort of stubs of marble that are on the temple walls. These would have been chipped, chiseled off. They needed to lift the marble up. I mean, think about it. These sculptures are all made from huge drums and slabs of marble that are dragged in from a mountain, Mount Penteli, not near Athens, with oxes. But also there is a marble floor, a thin layer of marble on the floor of the Propylaia, which was put there to protect the floor below. And when they were dragging in more marble, it was never taken off. Camp points out that the Propylaia and the Parthenon are really in proportion to each other. The Propylaia are almost as wide as the Parthenon is long, and the 2 buildings are oriented together. Well, the Erechtheion, built around started around 421 BC. So in the middle of the time that Athens is in this major war with Sparta, and the Erechtheion, again, is really much more of a religious sacred building of Athens than the Parthenon. In fact, it's sometimes also it's also thought to be a temple to Athena Polias. Polias has that word that I think we're pretty familiar with now, the word for polis or city. So, well, the Erechtheion is a really interesting building. I'm going to be a little personal here and tell you that when I was taking Greek, when I was 13 years old, here in Berkeley with a grad student. There's a picture of this porch of the Caryatids, and I was just fascinated by it. I don't know why. The Caryatids are columns. They're sculptures of maidens, and I think I wanted to study Greek after, or even more, I wanted to not only to learn the Greek grammar, but to be able to read all about, why in the world there were these columns of maidens, and what in the world is going on with this building. So that's how you can launch a career by looking at a picture in a book, black and white even. This is a very interesting building. There are a lot of challenges for the architect. First of all, he had to kind of, deal with the fact that the Parthenon was a pretty imposing building. Second of all, this building is built on a slope. I mean, the Acropolis this is Mount Lycabettus in the background, but it's got a 3-meter difference from one end to the other, and it's the site. It's a very holy site in many ways, more than the Parthenon, where there are altars to Zeus, Poseidon, and Erechtheion, Hephaestus, a hero named Butes, statues of Athena and Hermes. There were supposed to be marks that were marks of Poseidon's triumph when he struck the ground. There's competition with Athena. There's a well of seawater. There's a sacred olive tree. there was a tomb to Cecrops, and there was a sanctuary to Pandrosos. So all of these things had to be accommodated for. I mean, Camp puts it very finally, I think. He says, well, this was a temple created by committee, and it really does have kind of a hodgepodge feel. This is actually the entrance over here, with 6 columns in a pro-style arrangement. So, you know, that refers to the arrangement of them being as forming sort of a porch. There are actually 4 columns on the western wall. You can't see them here. And there's a large Ionic porch on the western end. So this is the large Ionic porch. And then there's this smaller porch with the caryatids. And it was thought there were 2 sculpted friezes around the top of the building above the northern porch. These are very interesting. They had close up. They were made of green marble with white marble figures. So over here, so this is actually the west end of the building, and you see how it is built on very different elevations. So over here, we're still looking at the west end. This is the porch with the large Ionic columns. I mean, I think on top of thinking about just the whatever is involved in dragging these pieces of marble up a mountain to build them, also dealing with the fact that there's a very, you know, severe elevation slope going on here, and that's the front porch of the Erechtheion with the pro-style arrangement. There it is. So those are the major buildings, I would say, of the Acropolis to keep in mind. These are the caryatids. 5 of them are now in the British Museum in London. They're reproductions of them in the Acropolis Museum, and one of them is in the British Museum, excuse me. 5 of them are in Athens. Athens would, of course, like to have the 6th one back. But they too are created in such a way that the ones on the edges, their legs are stiff, as if they're kind of holding the building up. The other one is leaning. And then even though the drapery of their dresses actually kind of recalls the fluting on a column. It's thought they might be the daughters of Cecrops, an ancient Athenian king. And then when I went to the museum in Athens, I was only able to see reproductions of them because they were actually cleaning them up. One of the things to keep in mind is that when you see marble in any Greek temple or sculpture, whenever it's a lighter color, that is new marble. It is not the original. The original marble is always a darker color because it stood the test of time. And when another piece of marble is put in, to replace a fragment, a gap, it has to actually be the same kind of marble. So this is just a view of the caryatid porch from the inside. So this is our view of the main buildings, the Parthenon, the Erechtheion, and the Propylaia, along with, so here you can see the differences in the marble based on the age of the materials used, and these are these Ionic columns. And this is a good place to stop as any on the entrance to the temple with the stylobat, the staircase, which again is curved slightly in order to give it the illusion of straightness. So Herodotus this week, and a lot of information about some of the major buildings of Greece. And yes, I really do hope you will go there someday. You can bring your camp book as your guide, and I think it'll make for a very interesting tour.